perimeter buffers. And I'm sure, again, Mr. Robertson would be glad to read that short title.
Be glad to. This is an ordinance to amend Chapter 99, Articles 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6, Sections 99-5, 6, 23, 26, 27, 30, 31, and 32, and by adding a new Section 99-21A, and Chapter 115, Articles 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 28, Sections 115, 20, 25, 29, 37, 45, 53, and also 28 regarding perimeter buffers, and that's 115-208 regarding perimeter buffers around residential development.
Thank you.
So it's 115-208, not 28.
Yes, yeah.
And just for the record, if I could, Mr. President, just to confirm, so we have a copy in the record. We have a copy of the ordinance as it was introduced by County Council at its meeting of March 19th of this year. We have a copy of the staff memo, which is included in your paperless packet. We also have a copy of the modified ordinance with colouring added to the ordinance, which is included in your paperless packet, showing the proposed insertions and deletions from the Planning and Zoning Commission. And I would note that in total we received 16 comments, which are included in your paperless packet. And I'll yield to Mr. Robertson to summarise.
Absolutely. And just to go back, that was 218. I misspoke. It was 208. I said 208. It's 218 on that one number.
So advertised is 220 either.
Yeah, 218. And so what I plan to do is go through sort of a four-step process on this. We're going to go over the ordinances introduced briefly, which is the PowerPoint that you've seen, I think, 3 or 4 times so far. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that because we have seen it so many times. And then at that point, we're going to go through what Planning and Zoning's recommended changes were. We have an ordinance that's marked up that shows those, and that's not all that extensive. And then there was a comment that we received at the Planning and Zoning Commission that led to a sort of a less general or less specific recommendation. It wasn't tied to specific line numbers, addressing the timing of the installation of the buffers. So we'll talk about that last. So with that, what I'd like to do is go to the PowerPoint, which Jamie has up here. Just briefly, this whole initiative came out of multiple issues that County Council's been hearing about for quite some time in public comment with regard to specific applications or developments, et cetera. We hear about the insufficiency of the buffers that are installed or planned or that are required by code. We often hear about tree removal within the buffers, and there's multiple kinds of categories for that. Some is tree removals that, trees that were supposed to stay, they got removed. And then there's also the question of why'd you remove those trees when they're full-grown trees? Why didn't you keep them? Sort of the unnecessary tree removal aspect of it. We heard about timing of the buffer installation. We've heard about the inconsistent requirements for buffers between Chapter 99 and the 115 cluster design requirements. We've heard about what to do and how to remedy damage during site work and construction to the perimeter buffers. We've heard comments and questions about what to do or how to improve the preservation of established buffers, whether those are existing trees or buffers that were planted as part of a development. So this is one of those things that you all have heard multiple times. It goes back to, I think, most specifically that joint Planning and Zoning County Council meeting we had. And then I know there was some ranking that occurred with regard to council initiatives. And then since then, as staff worked through the buffer ordinance, we were in front of you multiple times kind of going through what the thought process was as we ultimately drafted the ordinance and then introduced it. So overview-wise, County Council, again, ranked buffers as the first item to update for the development design initiatives. We developed the ordinance based on the input received. It was introduced back in March. The Planning and Zoning hearing was on May 8th. And then on June 5, Planning and Zoning recommended approval with some suggestions. The first section of the ordinance is definitions. And because we've seen this before, I'm not going to go through each definition, but these are all terms that are used throughout the ordinance. Probably the most important are the perimeter buffer itself, which is a 30-foot wide area around the perimeter of the development, and The other most important one is if there's existing woodlands within that perimeter buffer area, the definition of a perimeter buffer protection area. So there's general standards within the ordinance. And this, again, deals with the types of vegetation and other things that are required in the case of existing woodlands. All trees and shrubs must be local and native species. It's 70% deciduous, 30% evergreen, 15 trees per linear feet planted. All trees and shrubs must be 6 feet in height at the time of planting and obtain a minimum height of 10 feet. It can include both existing woodlands and planted trees. When the resource buffer is required, because that's another code section, that takes precedent. Mr. Ryder.
I don't know if I should interject or wait till you're finished. So there was a comment from a letter we got that saying that the minimum 10-foot is not practical for shrubs. So the way that line reads, it sounds, and I don't know if that translates into the ordinance. So were we saying shrubs have to be a minimum 10-foot or just trees?
The way it is now, the trees need to be a minimum of 10
Right,
feet. And
which makes sense.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What's the 6 foot and the 10 foot?
6 feet in height at the time of planting, 10 feet, and there's a language that we have proposed at planning and zoning that it be of a species that is expected to achieve at least 10 feet in height at some
So
point.
less than 10 feet?
Yeah.
Vince, reading that though, says that shrubs also must be.
Minimum 10 feet.
Well, yeah, and I'm looking at the prior code, because this actually comes from the prior code. Currently in code today in Chapter 99, it talks about all deciduous trees, and this is the language, that are planted to establish the buffer planting shall have a minimum caliper of 1.5 inches and a minimum height of 6 feet above ground when planted in order to ensure that the trees will be capable of obtaining a minimum height of 10 feet above ground within 5 years of being planted. We looked at that, and there was a whole bunch of different variables in there, but that 6 feet and 10 feet was what made it through to this
I
ordinance.
guess my point is, what you just read says trees. That sentence there says all trees and shrubs.
That's correct. Just, if you would, give me 1 second.
Lines 308, Vince.
What's that?
Lines 308 to
308, that's what I was looking for.
321,
Thanks.
you'd say.
I want to see what the exact line, Because right now that's a point that maybe needs some amendment, because lines 309 to 3, well, and I'm looking at the revised one. Hold on 1 second. Bear with me.
Can I ask Jamie a quick question?
It does refer to trees and shrubs both in the ordinance, so we would have to eliminate the requirement for shrubs if that's what you want to do. But the flip side of that is, I would suggest there still needs to be a requirement for shrubs, because the purpose of this is to establish screening, so if you don't have a minimum height of some sort for all types, that's a fairly low threshold, and it doesn't achieve the purpose
My
of it.
point was not to push your button. Lawson did that, just munching come over here. Is that it might be difficult getting shrubs that are going to grow to 10 feet. Pretty good size shrub.
So if I can jump
I'm
in.
not a forester, I don't know about it, maybe I'm well based, but it looks like to me that shrubs should be maybe a smaller
Yeah,
height.
and I'm reviewing it again, just because I want to look at the ordinance that was introduced, because there was the second document that was planning and zoning's changes. Just so we're clear on the ordinance that was introduced at line 309, it says, all deciduous and evergreen trees that are planted shall have a minimum height of 6 feet, and when planted, and obtain a minimum height of 10 feet. So the ordinance, this is a summary of the ordinance. The ordinance itself talks about trees.
And the ordinance that you just read off did not mention shrubs.
Did not mention shrubs, that's correct.
Well,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
just, we should take shrubs off there.
Yeah,
Or whatever.
well, and this is just a summary
I'm just
stuff,
saying,
yeah.
but-
But it's a good point and a fair question.
Public
based
doesn't
on-
get confused about
That's
what
right.
that says and what your, whatever.
Yeah.
Mr. Schaefer, you had a question or
Yeah,
something?
just real quick, the line items on the copy of the ordinance we have they changed recently? Has this been amended and the line items changed?
The paper copy at your desks, which has colored highlights, is the planning and zoning recommended changed version. So to answer Mr. Schaefer's question, yes. This is,
The reason I ask, I got comments from a constituent, and her line items are different than what I have.
correct. Her line items would be the original ordinance that is what Vince is starting to go over, and then step 2 is going to be reviewing the document that you have at your stations that have colored versions. Yes, no.
No, that's not you. And it's, Mr. Schaefer, it is one of those quirks of working with legislation, you know. So,
You changing the noise.
yeah, we wanted to figure out a way that we could show you easily what planning and zoning recommended, which it achieves that goal. The problem is it throws off all the numbering when you do that. So anyhow. So returning to this, so it's just trees. And then the last point was permanent signage will mark the perimeter buffer. And in the ordinance, again, there's details on what that signage, the size of it and what it has to say.
I have a question about that signage. How, the signs are going to be how far apart again?
They're 100 feet apart, and the reason we did that was so that theoretically every backyard would see a sign from some point, whether it was right behind their lot or, you know, if we're looking at cluster subdivisions, you know, it would be on your neighbor's lot. You would
Was
see
there a
it.
requirement to put it in the middle of the lot or in the corners of the lots? Or?
No, it's just along the outside of either the perimeter buffer or the perimeter buffer area, every 100 feet. You know, to just, again, so it would be visually. We didn't want to have signs every single lot. You know, the idea was just make it visible to as many lots as possible. And 5x7's the size, and it also includes a statement about the potential penalties for violating that.
We're going to get into phasing of planning later.
Yeah. So, continuing, there's a distinction between perimeter buffers.
I apologize. Back to your last slide. Do you now have a list of what native species are?
We do not. There is one. We looked into that, and we looked into what Newcastle County had, and we actually
Is the plan to adopt a list or not adopt a list?
not adopt a list. The idea being that, you know, we're going to require the types of trees you're planting on a site plan and the landscape plan and the perimeter buffer plan that you have to submit. That's all going to go through planning, zoning, staff review, and theoretically TAC review, which would include the Department of Agriculture. There was just so many different lists and so many different types and species and subspecies and everything else that it just got really complicated. And the other thing is we were always concerned about incorporating some other jurisdiction's list into our code, because then that can just change, you know, by whomever is in charge of that list, and that becomes problematic. So that I mean, we could incorporate one, but that was a conscious decision on our part after looking into it not to do that.
The lemon and coconut trees are not on that list?
I suppose no coconuts for the development.
And we did clear out that invasive species are called out in the ordinance as well. So if you need to go in and do work for invasive species, that is permitted, because invasive species lists are well defined.
So, again, it distinguishes between perimeter buffers where there's existing woodlands within the area that's going to become the perimeter buffer, or there's no woodlands, essentially. You know, it's been tilled right to the property line, and it's just wide open. Under the scenario where there's existing woodlands, this triggers a variety of new things. One is a forest assessment by a certified professional, and that's defined in the code. The woodlands must be shown on the site plan and the landscape plan. They have to remain in their natural state with very limited activity. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the perimeter buffer woodlands need to be protected by the 20-foot buffer, perimeter buffer protection area, basically, as it says here, a buffer to the buffer. It will be fenced off and marked off during construction so that it's not disturbed. That's required by code. You are allowed to do selective clearing, removal of invasive species and dead trees in the woodlands, which is permitted. That sort of follows what we have in the resource buffers now. Walking trails are permitted. Access point to the woodlands for buffer maintenance is permitted. In other words, there has to be easements so you can get through the lots to get back to the buffers to do the maintenance. Any unauthorized removal or damage to trees within the woodlands is subject to mitigation requirements, which we'll get to. And the woodlands, you cannot go in there and clear, grade, or grub within that woodlands area. Again, the whole idea is if you have existing trees, you got to keep them. And they have to be protected with that 20-foot perimeter buffer protection area so that not only are the trees within the 30 feet protected, but the root system of those trees is not disturbed by site work and development.
So the 30 feet is to be undisturbed. The 20-foot buffer to the buffer is not to be, that won't necessarily have to remain in a,
Well, that's not supposed to be grubbed or anything either, so, because that's the idea, you want to protect those trees within the.
remain in its natural condition.
It will, and that's sort of, but it's somewhat, it's in its natural condition, but somewhat sacrificially, because the extra 20 feet itself.
Those roots are going to be damaged.
Right, that's right, right.
Okay.
That's right.
Now, the trails that run through, can they have material on them like asphalt or stone or shells, et cetera?
I don't think we specify what types of material. Mr. Whitehouse, I don't know if you recall on that, but I know we look at mulch and things like that being within the buffer area appropriate.
Correct. I mean, there are different types of material, like mulch would be something you place on the land.
Something natural, not a man-made product.
Correct. You could put stone on them without needing to excavate. It's when you excavate to put in a foundation as such, or membrane underneath, that's when we start looking at excavation. But there are many types of trail that do not require that. So.
Are we specifying what can and cannot be?
We haven't at this point, no, but we could. I mean, that's an easy enough revision, so that it has to be some
Will
sort
it
of
be
natural.
pervious
Yeah,
material
that's good.
only?
That's a good way to
Yeah,
put
I
it.
think the material is less important than pervious versus impervious.
Yeah, that's probably the right way to put it.
What happens if the engineer designs an outfall structure for stormwater going through that protected buffer area?
It does state that outfalls are permitted, because we have to have that, but you can't have any other stormwater management features within the buffer.
What do they do about reforesting that disturbed area? Anything?
Well, I mean, depending on how the outfall is designed, you wouldn't have to reforest that because if it's a pipe, that's one thing. But if it's a swale that gets out to some other water feature offsite, that wouldn't have to be forested. But that's all. It's only for conveyance. It's not for, treatment or storage or anything like that. It's just to get the water offsite.
What would happen, it might be covered later on, if you are, I apologize. What happens if, for whatever reason, let's say the sewer and or water has to go through this area? I'm just saying that it's county sewer, are we going to find ourselves or whatever for disturbing something, or? I mean, it could be that, let's say DP&L said this has got to go through here. It can't go any other way.
Right.
You got to go through where the trees and the buffer are.
Yeah, no, so, I mean, you're allowed to disturb it for sewer. Obviously, the same thing with the entrance to the development,
Okay.
that's excluded from it as well.
But utilities, if they're required, can go through there. And
They're going to be treated the same as stormwater, but they go through not, I guess, perpendicular, not parallel.
Right, okay,
so.
all right, okay. Thank you. Mr. Riley.
We received an email, I don't know if everyone got it earlier, or I think I just got it. And it looks like it's from the Delaware Home Builders. Got a number of points on here that I don't know if we want to consider them point by point, but one of them says that lines 362 through 363 potentially conflicts with stormwater management regulations. For example, if you have a site where the existing wooded buffer area drains onto a neighboring property, stormwater management regulations would require you to control that runoff, which would involve grading the area. This goes to the overarching point that compliance with regulations and utility services should be exempted and allow for existing tree removal.
We received that same comment at the planning and zoning level. We talked about it with the commission. We talked about it internally as well. And at least up to this point, we wanted to take a firm stand against that, that you would have to treat and retain your stormwater management internally of that buffer area and then convey it off-site. So in other words, if there's runoff from the site, you got to deal with it before it gets to that buffer area and then pass it through the buffer area to get it off-site. The concern was that, not to use stormwater management term, but that just erodes the whole purpose potentially of the buffer. If you've got to just grade right through it, we want you to grade to the point of that buffer and then convey it through.
Right, right. And there shouldn't be so much water coming off the buffer that it would create a nuisance, I wouldn't think. And the rule is that no more can leave the property post-development than would have prior to development. So if the buffer area is undisturbed, that should meet that standard.
That's the idea. Now, that's something that came up at planning and zoning. We didn't have an opportunity to review it, with engineering and other folks before planning and zoning had to make a recommendation of it. That might be something we need to look at, with our engineering department, just to make sure we're on the right foot on that. But I will tell you, that was something that at least staff felt strongly about, because that theoretically could undermine the whole purpose of this,
Right.
if the whole boundary went away just for stormwater management reasons.
I don't know if you want to review any of these other points that they raise here or not, but.
And I know that one was
derail
raised
your
before, but,
presentation either.
yeah. Well, and we can keep going. So the next slide was rules for woodlands cleared within 5 years of the application. In other words, a 5-year look back. This requires a forest assessment by a certified professional. Those woodlands must be planted back with at least 15 trees for every 50 linear feet. Recall that if you didn't have to do that, if you had a clean piece of property that didn't have anything on there, it's 15 trees for 100 linear feet. This doubles that tree density if it's been forested within 5 years, or the forest's been removed within 5 years prior. The new woodlands may border the perimeter buffer. At no time shall the perimeter buffer be less than 30 feet in width, which is what we've required. Perimeter buffer in the new woodlands shall meet the planning requirements contained in Section 2 of the ordinance, which is what we just went over. The applicants may choose to replant property other than the one harvested, or protect an off-site woodlands area as reviewed and approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission, and then it gives the standards for where that would be and how that would be planted. I know Mr. Hutt talked about that one in particular at Planning and Zoning. His concern was that, and again, this is a summary, but the ordinance talked about replanting or planting new trees on an off-site area. The idea being that wouldn't be exclusive to acquiring a treed off-site area and preserving existing trees, which it may actually be better. I mean, obviously, to preserve forest. So that would encapsulate that as well. And this is the rules for when no woodlands exist. Again, the wide open piece of property, and you need to establish buffers. So again, the developer must comply with the buffer standards and the landscape plan requirements. Again, the newly planted buffer will be fenced off and marked during construction, and then all perimeter buffers will have a 2-year guarantee. So again, this is for new plantings. It does, because it's new plantings, this one doesn't have the buffer to the buffer. There's no perimeter buffer protection area, so it's just the 30 feet. This is the requirement for the perimeter buffer landscape plan. And this just goes over the details that need to be shown on that plan so that planning and zoning and staff have something to compare what's been submitted and approved with what actually exists on site. And I'm not going to go through all those because it basically captures things we've already talked about, the signage, the types of trees, that sort of thing. Timing, bonds, and guarantees. This is one that got some significant attention. But as introduced, there are bonding and timing requirements and guarantees for the installation and protection of the buffers, trees, and shrubs. As introduced, the perimeter buffer per phase must be planted prior to the first residential building permit for that respective or that particular phase. In other words, you've got to have it all in and planted before you can pull a building permit within that phase.
Can I interrupt
Sure.
you on that point? So if you're building a subdivision, you have phase 1, phase 2, 3, 4. And phases 2, 3, and 4 have no proposed construction activity or development work like stormwater installation, outfalls, et cetera. Why can't you require all that to be planted during phase 1?
So that was a conversation we had from day one, and not trying to dodge it, but it's tougher than it sounds, because you need to establish that buffer to plant it. You know, you need to have the whole site graded, you know, so you have your established grade next to where the buffer plantings are going to be. You've got to have access to it. You know, there's a guarantee that everything lives, and so, you know, there's got to be theoretically water that can get to it. And so, you know, what we wanted to do was avoid the possibility where somebody just jumps ahead and, you know, starts clearing other phases before they've installed the buffers for that phase and then the next phase. So, you know, you have to have your perimeter buffer installed before you'll get a notice to proceed in the first phase, before you'll get a notice to proceed on the second phase. Where it gets a little, where this ordinance isn't as specific and is what Planning and Zoning's recommendation dealt with, was a time frame. It says you can't go to the next thing without completing your buffer. That's the way the ordinance says now. It doesn't say, though, well, what if you never get to the next thing? You know, do you have to have your buffer installed within a certain time frame? That's something that Planning and Zoning didn't have time to specifically articulate because it's complex, and we don't know exactly what the right amount of time would be. You know, is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it, you know, 18 months from a notice to proceed? I don't know what the right time frame is, but the recommendation was, based on public comment, there still should be, building permit or not, a drop dead date from when you get your notice to proceed to when that buffer's got to be installed in each phase.
And what is that?
That's what I said. We don't have that yet. That's something that I'm sure we're going to hear from probably the public on, and you all need to consider as well what the appropriate time frame for that
What do you
is.
think, 12 months?
It shouldn't be 6 months. That's too fast. I think 18 months is probably a little bit too long. 12 months might be the sweet spot. You know, but I don't have anything to back that up. That's just basically an opinion, you know, from my side. So.
One other condition that we've had to try to deal with and it hasn't been ironed out yet is when a subdivision comes in and the phases may be in different locations and they bump up against an existing development. And that seems to want to have some preferential implementation to the buffer because you're coming in against a house that's already there. So if you're out in the middle of nowhere and there's no homes, that's probably different than when you're coming up against another development, which we think we need to iron that out as well. And in fact, we have an illustration to show that here in a minute.
Yeah, and what complicates it is, you know, legitimately, folks are concerned because there's site work potentially that's occurring right in their, not their backyard, because we want to preserve hopefully the existing buffer, and then there's site work that's happening right beyond that. I don't know that we can ever have somebody install the buffer. Let me back up. If you have a forested piece of property, this whole conversation really doesn't matter because we're saying you can't touch those trees anyway, you know? So have that on site work. You're always going to have 30 feet plus another 20 feet of buffer from day one that's never going to be touched. That's always going to be there. So really it's a scenario where you're planning a new buffer. But when you're planning a new buffer, there's always going to be some disturbance. We can't avoid that because when the development occurs, to get to the buffer, they're going to come in the construction entrance, you know, start grading, and they're going to grade and work their way to wherever this buffer is going to be planted. So there's got to be, unfortunately, some period of time when there's going to be some disturbance with equipment, et cetera, prior to the trees getting planted. There's no way around that. You know, you can't plant the trees before you can physically get to them, you know, and do the site work that reaches that point. So that gets back to, all right, we know we're going to have to deal with it for some reasonable amount of time. What's the maximum reasonable amount of time that you should allow so that somebody, you know, has to live with that before this new buffer's planted? And that's the question. That's whether it's 6 months or 12 months. I don't know if I articulated that very well, but yeah.
That sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
If you had,
But I will say that this ordinance right now, regardless of all that, eliminates the situation we heard from so many people about where a developer just goes in and clear cuts the whole thing right to the property line.
well, that's
You know?
kind of
That's
where
not
I'm
gonna
thinking
happen
right now.
Yeah.
You know, under this, let's say you have 500 acres and you have, you know, you're going to do 5 phases, each approximately 100 acres. And you go in and you clear cut the entire 500, and then you do a phase and then you don't finish. And it leaves 400 acres
Right.
completely obliterated mess. I mean, would that actually be permitted under this?
Well, you're going to have to deal with Department of Agriculture permits and all that stuff, but it wouldn't be permitted within 50 feet of the property line. You know, subject to getting whatever SCD requirements you have and Department of Agriculture requirements, you still got to leave 50 feet of existing forest between the property line and the disturbed area, the forested area.
But that's only on developments going forward. It's not it's not retro.
Yeah, and it would be retro, yeah.
Wish we could.
And hopefully the existing buffer, and then there's site work that's happening right beyond that. I don't know that we can ever have somebody install the buffer. Let me back up. If you have a forested piece of property, this whole conversation really doesn't matter because we're saying you can't touch those trees anyway, you know? So have that on site work. You're always going to have 30 feet plus another 20 feet of buffer from day one that's never going to be touched. That's always going to be there. So really it's a scenario where you're planning a new buffer. But when you're planning a new buffer, there's always going to be some disturbance. We can't avoid that because when the development occurs, to get to the buffer, they're going to come in the construction entrance, you know, start grading, and they're going to grade and work their way to wherever this buffer is going to be planted. So there's got to be, unfortunately, some period of time when there's going to be some disturbance with equipment, et cetera, prior to the trees getting planted. There's no way around that. You know, you can't plant the trees before you can physically get to them, you know, and do the site work that reaches that point. So that gets back to, all right, we know we're going to have to deal with it for some reasonable amount of time. What's the maximum reasonable amount of time that you should allow so that somebody, you know, has to live with that before this new buffer's planted? And that's the question. That's whether it's 6 months or 12 months. I don't know if I articulated that very well, but yeah.
That sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
If you had,
But I will say that this ordinance right now, regardless of all that, eliminates the situation we heard from so many people about where a developer just goes in and clear cuts the whole thing right to the property line.
well, that's
You know?
kind of
That's
where
not
I'm
going to
thinking
happen
right
now.
now.
Yeah.
You know, under this, let's say you have 500 acres and you have, you know, you're going to do 5 phases, each approximately 100 acres. And you go in and you clear cut the entire 500 and then you do a phase and then you don't finish. And it leaves 400 acres
Right.
completely obliterated mess. I mean, would that actually be permitted under this?
Well, you're going to have to deal with Department of Agriculture permits and all that stuff, but it wouldn't be permitted within 50 feet of the property line. You know, subject to getting whatever SCD requirements you have and Department of Agriculture requirements, you still got to leave 50 feet of existing forest between the property line and the disturbed area, the forested area.
But that's only on developments going forward. It's not retro.
Yeah, and it would be retro, yeah.
Wish we could.
And on the back end, if somebody does decide to remove all that, or, you know, we have that 5-year look back, if you go in and clear cut the whole thing to the property line as the property owner knowing you're going to sell it, there's a look back in here that we're going to make you plant it at a higher density when you go in and replant it. I mean, so there's carrots and sticks involved in this. Both.
Yeah, and I get it from the developer's point of view. It's expensive to get people to come in and do the tree work, but on the other hand, you know, you might be 5-10 years before they get to Section 5, you know, and it's just a mess, you know, and it doesn't sit well with me.
Well, and that's why, you know, we need to get some input from our county engineering department on the timing of it. But, you know, I think your concern is abated when you have an existing forest that's being developed, because, again, you're going to keep 50 feet of that around there. But if you have a piece of property that's been tilled or it's just, you know, meadow or whatever, right to the property line, you know, then there's going to be planning requirements. We need to tighten up on those planning requirements. So, like, to your point, you know, somebody doesn't just go in and clear the whole thing. They're not worried about the first building permit in phase 1, you know, and then you just got a moonscape all the way around. So, you know, we said you can't do X until you've done Y, but we haven't said how fast you got to do Y in, you know, so, you know, which is planting those trees. So I think
Do you think it's 12 months?
that's just sort of my opinion on it, you know, off the top of my head. I don't think that's too long necessarily. I don't think that's unreasonably short either.
Kind of looking at it from home or just point of view and wondering how long I'd want to look at that, you know. But
Exactly.
it is somebody else's property. I understand that too. So
You know, and keeping in mind that there's other things, you know, there's going to be phasing plans that are reviewed by planning and zoning and county engineering. the phasing sizes. There's economic decisions that developers need to make based on, bonding requirements and everything else too for phasing. So there's a lot of different things that come into play about how big your phase is going to be or how many phases you're going to have that are almost independent of the buffering too. I can't remember where we were. Timing and bonds and guarantees. As I know we were on this first bullet. The perimeter buffer per phase must be planted prior to the first residential building permit for the respective phase. We talked about that. When woodlands exist, the perimeter buffer and protection area shall be protected and marked prior to the notice to proceed for the site work or construction. The developer is responsible for removal of all stakes, guy wires, and protected fencing when it's done. The bond or other guarantee to cover the buffer has to be 125% or $50,000, whichever is greater, of the cost of installation and the value of the replacement plantings. And all guarantees for the buffer existing and planted will be for 2 years. There was a clarification that planning and zoning had on that, but it's 2 years. Maintenance-wise, there is perimeter buffer maintenance requirements that really aren't spelled out all that clearly. The developer is responsible for the survival of the perimeter buffer for 2 years, and the perpetual maintenance of the perimeter buffer will be recorded in the restrictive covenants for the subdivision. So that just puts everybody on notice that we have these buffers and we have to maintain them. And additionally, that's a requirement of the phraseology on the signage that we say, so individual homeowners will know that as well.
What happens if the trees get planted in June, they all die, and they sit there dead for 2 years? Is there any mechanism to get them replanted that coming fall immediately?
So we would not ordinarily require someone to plant immediately in the month of June. We would probably naturally wait to the next growing season. But in all scenarios, the performance bond would be in place. So then we would reach out to require replanting. So that kind of gets into the enforcement and implementation. But to answer your question, we wouldn't require immediate replanting that month in the month of June. It's not an ideal month for replanting. We probably worked with the developer to plant in the September following that. So.
How about the original planting?
The
original installation of the buffer?
If the original installation of the buffer fails during the development, then they're required to maintain that and replace any damaged sections. So again, it's linked to the phasing of the development. So if phase 1 buffer is in order to get the notice of commencement and the notice to proceed letter, the buffer has to be in. So your scenario is if the buffer fails to survive prior to the next phase, then that would have to be repaired prior to the issuance of the next phase. So there's multiple layers of mechanisms to protect the development throughout the implementation process.
Does it make sense to put the buffer in June prior? Plantings in June?
Very rarely. Well, we certainly would not require it during the month of June, and very rarely, in my experience, will a developer voluntarily put a buffer in during June. So not unless it were irrigated or properly cared for.
So you have a mechanism to allow that?
Yes.
Here's the issue, though, and Mr. Whitehouse, you're going to have to think about this. I don't know that it's as much in the ordinance as it is in the implementation, because I know what Mr. Schaefer is getting at, and like we heard this from somebody in one of the comments. If we say you can't pull the initial building permit till the buffers are installed, we as a county, we're going to hear it if we say, well, all right, the county's not going to allow you to install them or inspect them until the fall, that basically holds up building permits for 3 months. So again, that's an implementation issue that we're going to have to look at, I think, outside of the ordinance. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but I think, yeah, that's kind of a concern timing-wise. So, and the other thing is, too, we're going to make sure that the staff is that the trees are planted and that they survive. And the 2-year period runs from the time of substantial completion of that particular phase. So that extends out that 2 years quite a bit. And at that point, too, if the trees are dead or dying, Mr. Whitehouse's staff's not going to release the bonding until they're replanted, or they're going to call the bonds, take the money, and plant the trees, whichever. So there's sort of protective measures all along the way. The next topic is perimeter buffer tree mitigation. This is the one that deals with what happens when trees or shrubs are removed or damaged without authorization. Again, if that occurs, and this doesn't include an act of God or natural causes, a tree mitigation plan must be developed by a licensed professional. The tree replacement must be at a rate of 3 trees for every 1 tree removed or damaged, and all trees and shrubs must meet the perimeter buffer standards, size and height, and landscape plan requirements. So if somebody goes in there and starts chopping down trees, you've got to plant 3 trees for every 1 that was chopped down. That's essentially what that
How do
means.
you define act of God? And why do you always blame God for stuff?
I don't. I mean, that's a legal
How
term
do you
that's used.
define an act of God?
So that would be storm, fire, wind.
Tornado or something?
Yeah.
But not just heavy rain.
No, not just heavy rain. So, yeah. The next subject is violations and penalties. And this section defines the penalties for violation of the new requirements that may be imposed. And this one actually follows the penalties that we established for the resource buffer ordinance that was approved some time ago. And it applies to not just the developer, but any homeowner, the HOA, or anybody that goes in and causes damage. There's a fine of $10,000 per acre, pro rata. Again, that mirrors what we had in the resource buffer for the disturbance of the perimeter buffer protection area. The tree mitigation plan that we talked about is required, and then building permits, zoning permits, and inspections will be held until the tree mitigation is complete and everything's approved by planning and zoning. Again, that process just follows what we did with the resource buffers. So really, that summarizes the ordinance in a nutshell. What I'd like to do, and I don't know who's driving this, if we could put the planning and zoning ordinance up here, just so as I said, it throws off the numbers of the ordinance, but it shows you the text that's been changed, and this shouldn't take that long.
This is the Word document at your desk. Jamie, I think I loaded it in Word already if you want to look for it.
So this came, we got a lot of good comments at planning and zoning with regard to specific terms or additions or deletions. And so this was a result of that. This was a change, first to the forest assessment definition. There was the recommendation to add the term forest inventory in addition to tree survey, just so there was a little more beef to that. The other thing, it talked in the proposed ordinance about individual trees to be preserved. There was a comment that while an individual tree may or may not be that important, if there's a grouping of those trees, that may be more important than the single individual tree. So that was an addition. Another comment was to add a new definition, which is of a forest assessment report. Basically, we had a forest assessment, but we didn't define the outcome of that. So the forest assessment report basically is a written summary prepared by a professional, which is defined there, of what the forest assessment is. Again, so it's documented going forward with all of this. So another comment was in the definition of perimeter buffer, there wasn't a really good explanation of the purpose of that, or one of the purposes anyway. So I know there was a specific sentence that was proposed. We changed that up a little bit, but added a sentence to that definition that says the perimeter buffer shall function to filter views from and into a subdivision in such a manner that improves the screening than if no landscaping was provided. Basically, so you're better off with this buffer than you would be without it. So it gives a purpose for it. There was another recommendation that the plan, this is sort of a terminology one, be submitted instead of prepared with regard to the perimeter buffer landscape plan. This is the one, and I think the home builders suggested this, but I may be wrong. The language was, back to what we're talking about, the deciduous and evergreen trees that are planted shall have a minimum height of 6 feet above ground when planted. The language was, and obtain a minimum height of 10 feet. There was better wording that was suggested, deleting that language, minimum height of 10 feet, and change it to say, shall be a species that typically achieves a height of at least 10 feet, because that's more documented. within, this really has to do with that definition of woodlands assessment, or excuse me, forest assessment and forest assessment report. And so we just changed the terminology to refer to the report and delete the language that's now incorporated into that definition of the forest assessment report. And this was a request that Mr. Mears had, and it's a good one. And two things. Clarifying that, one, at no time shall the ground within the woodlands area of a perimeter buffer, we added in, and perimeter buffer protection area be cleared, graded, regraded, or grubbed. So that's clear that includes not just the buffer, but the protection area. And also, Mr. Mears and the commission felt that it should also be specified that stump grinding can't occur, because that just, or excuse me, stump grinding must occur. You can't go in there and grub the area, because grubbing would do more damage than the stump grinding would, since that's more specific to the individual tree, if there's like a dead tree, for example, in the area. The next one is that you'll see on the screen with F. This has to do with the, if the area was cleared, and the mitigation plan, it was to be reviewed and approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission. There was a recommendation that that be changed to the director, and I'm sure the director would do that with input from staff, just because that's a more of a technical requirement that staff's more suited to sorting out than the commission. The staff would probably do it anyway, and then telling the commission what to do through their recommendations, so we just said leave it at the director. This one just clarified the term woodlands was used, and we wanted to be more specific. Access points to the perimeter buffer and perimeter buffer protection area should be the terms that are used. The next one had to do with the timing of it, and some of the others that follow. This was on the landscape plan. It said originally a note confirming that the developer guarantees the full cost of replacement for any trees, shrubs, or existing woodlands. That was an extraneous phrase because it's the full cost of replacement of the perimeter buffer. And we wanted to make it consistent with other language that said, again, after the determination of substantial completion in accordance with Section 9931. That term substantial completion, that's a defined term in Section 9931, so that's a date that staff can mark on their calendar, and that means that they now know that that 2 years is running. So there's some changes throughout that reflect that. Originally, it talked about the latter of 2 years after substantial completion or HOA turnover, but that's such an undefined time within the county's ability to record, time frames, that we just kept it with what's within our code, which is 9931.
So at the substantial completion, the clock starts ticking. They've got 2 years that they're still responsible.
That's right.
Then what?
So 2 years is up. The bonding's in place throughout that 2 years. After 2 years, there's going to be an inspection by planning and zoning staff. Everything's good. Bonds get released. Everything's not good. Trees need to be replaced or replanted, and then the bonds are released at that point. But still then going forward, there's always going to be that maintenance obligation.
And who picks that up?
The HOA picks that up.
But it could be 10 years before the HOA takes over.
Well, there's always going to be an HOA, whether it's,
The developer's HOA.
yeah, the developer's
So
going
the
to,
developer controls the HOA, he's still on the hook.
yeah, through the HOA, that way.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
So I think Mr. Riley already asked this question. So the 2 years expires, they come in and replant the dead, diseased trees, and they die, and is that the question he just asked?
Yeah, I
Did
think
you
so.
answer that?
Yeah. They have to replant them. They have to maintain them.
When?
Yeah. Well, they're going to have to, and again, we're complaint driven. So at that point, if there's dead trees out there, they're going to go to planning and zoning staff, and they're going to handle that and talk to either theoretically the HOA. I don't know, Mr. Whitehouse, if you want to add to that.
Correct. And we see that at the moment, is that we will receive a phone call that the buffer is not as it should be. We inspect, find the trees are not present, and then we reach out to the HOA or whoever the responsible party is. We go by the owner of record, his answer is. So if it's the HOA, it will show officially on our database as the owner of record. That's the primary point of contact.
So the bond's already been released? and then you try to call them?
So if the bond has been released, there'll be no bond to fall back on at that point. So.
What leverage do you have?
Then we have that tree mitigation leverage, then we have the penalties, they still are in effect. So if somebody goes in and damages trees and staff's verified that, that's what those penalties were that we have in here, and they could
So what, do you have to
initiate
go to court and get a judgment?
it with the constable's office the way.
There'll be the last course of action necessary. That's extremely unlikely, but that's part of the stick in the series of carrots and sticks in this ordinance.
So this next deletion, this is the one that talked about that HOA turnover that we were just talking about. So it's just all tied to substantial completion under 9931. And then the last one, the last two, we added, the term perimeter buffer in that one line. And then also deleted the term in the form of newly created woodlands from the tree mitigation. So, because what follows in that, it talks about the tree mitigation plan. It gives the specific requirements for what you have to do if you have to mitigate things. So that phrase wasn't really necessary since it's specifically defined in the language after it. So those, with the exception of the last one that we already sort of talked about, but wasn't tied to specific line items, the last recommendation of planning and zoning, and I'll just read it to you. County Council should also consider a revision to require that a development must install a perimeter buffer at or within a certain time after a notice to proceed when the new development is next to an existing approved or under construction development or homes. That way, if the development is next to existing homes, for example, there's more certainty about the timing of the installation of the buffer. So again, that's the situation about buffer installation, not existing buffer, because if you have the trees there already, they're going to stay. So, and that was that time frame, that 6 months, 12 months, 18 months we were talking about. So that essentially concludes my presentation. Sorry I wasn't like Mr. Sentman, Mr. Fuqua, or Mr. Whitehouse. It was a little bit longer, but this is much more detailed. I don't know if Mr. Whitehouse or Mr. Lawson were actively involved in this from day one. If any of you have anything you'd like to add. Any other questions, or we can hear from the public? I would say, sort of like the ADU ordinance, there's a lot of information here. We certainly need to look at that timing aspect of it a little bit more. I think get some information from our county engineering department on that timing, and then, have some recommendations for potential motion to approve it. So, thank you.
Okay, seeing no further questions from council, is there anyone here today that would like to address this proposed ordinance? Mr. Barrasso?
Subdivisions that we have in Sussex County. They're commercial, there's excessive lighting, there's traffic, there's parking lots, and we feel the benefits of perimeter buffers should be required and realized in all developments, particularly in C4 developments that have so much impact. And I think Jill is going to, following up behind me, is going to show some examples of that. So with that, I just want to say that we really appreciate the opportunity to respectfully present these proposed changes to you. But we also recognize that perimeter buffers are really just a springboard to a broader discussion that, as your design meeting had back in September, and you brought up 4 or 5 different things that we need to be looking at and moving forward with. I was really excited to see the forest assessment report, because that's going in toward our idea of these developments having a conservation plan that looks at the conservation, management, and preservation of all woodlands and natural features. We need to have a discussion on open space. What's the appropriate percentage of open space? What's its condition and function, and steps for tree preservation and maintenance? Need to deal with landscape requirements beyond perimeter buffers, and finally, necessary stormwater and drainage requirements. With that, thank you. I really appreciate your attention and time, and Jill Hicks is up next. Thank you.
Jill Hicks, Chapel Green, Lewis. This is a good day. And thank you for getting us here and the work that has gone into this ordinance. In the definition section of this ordinance, beginning at line 219, it states that perimeter buffers are, quote, managed area of planted or existing trees and shrubs and associated landscaping, located along the entire outer perimeter of any portion of a major subdivision. And again, at line 298, there shall be a perimeter buffer established along the boundary of every major subdivision or residential plant community. How do I take this forward? Oops. This guy?
I was using this one.
This one? Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's much easier.
It might not be on the right screen, though.
I'm sorry?
I think, yeah.
Yeah.
I messed up.
Thank you.
The wrong way. There you go.
Okay. Let's see here. Recently, instead of perimeter buffers, stockade fences and berms are appearing in place of natural buffers along our roadways. Fences and berms are permitted, which is not a problem, but they cannot replace a forested, reforested, or afforested buffer. Studies show that tree-lined roadways provide a calming effect, another benefit of forested perimeter buffers, particularly along our roadways. We are recommending that language be added so that it is clear and codified that these options of fences and berms are not to be installed to the exclusion or replacement for wooded or planted perimeter buffers. If there is a need for a stockade fence for noise reduction or protection from the roadway, install the fence to the interior of the forested or planted perimeter buffer, but never in place of. And here are examples of what we're seeing that we want to mitigate. And if you look at this, this is Route 24, and that car that's in front of me is all the way up at the next slide. But you can see how nice it is to drive Route 24 through this wooded area, and then you hit this. This is Beech Tree Preserve, where they tore down the forest and replaced it with a stockade fence. This is Lewis Georgetown Highway at Red Mill Pond. Again, forest taken down, replaced with a stockade fence. Old Landing Road. Kindleton, Cedar Grove Road. And this one is a particular problem because those trees will probably not reach maturity, and they're already starting to die off at the upper end. They're too close to the fence, they're too close to the roadway, but they're certainly not providing what they were meant to do. But again, I think as a county, we don't want to see buffers and forests replaced by stockade fences and run along our roadways. This stockade fence runs along the south side of Route 9. After a recent HOA meeting at Lewis Crossing, a resident requested that I come back to this location and observe the effectiveness of this stockade fence after dark. These lights shine right into the living areas and bedrooms of all these homes. During the daylight hours, when driving along Route 9, look into their backyards directly across from this service station, and you will see that several of these families have now taken to filling their backyards with conifers. But not all of them can afford this option or can afford to sacrifice their backyards, nor should they have had to do so. Stockade fences cannot do all that trees can do and provide for us. We are asking that line 461 read, may include, but never to the exclusion of the forested or planted perimeter buffer and its perimeter buffer protection area. By adding this language in line 461, where the ordinance addresses roadways, it will strengthen and accomplish the intent and protections needed. Timing. This slide was taken from inside my home. Because our home is located adjacent to Phase 6 of this development, the project manager said that we will not see building behind our home for another 6 to 8 years, depending on the market. Therefore, my neighbors and I will live with the abandoned destruction and construction debris for 6 to 8 years or more. Then for years beyond that, we will have the construction work and equipment upon us. The residents of Chapel Green could live with these conditions for a decade or more. Before the clearing of that entire forest, we rarely heard traffic on Robinsonville Road, nearly a mile away as the crow flies. Now, all day long, we hear the constant backup warnings of heavy construction equipment, the banging of metal upon metal, and in some cases, still some occasional clearing. We can no longer sit on our deck and enjoy a morning cup of coffee or comfortably read a book during weekdays and Saturdays for the constant noise heard clear across the 110 acres of cleared land. If they had not clear-cut the entire parcel, we could have had 6 to 8 more years of relative quiet. The practice of clear-cutting hundreds of acres at a time is not only an abuse of the natural environment, but to area residents as well. Tidewater Landing, looking into Phase 5 and 6 of Chase Oaks. This photo was taken from a home in Tidewater Landing, where behind it was cleared for Chase Oaks. The clearing was done in late 2021, 3 years ago. This debris is located on the area proposed for Phases 5 and 6. No permits have been issued for these phases, yet this resident is living with this pile of massive debris behind her home. Let's correct these unsuitable conditions for the futures of others. Residents should not be made to pay the cost year after year after year for the convenience and profitability of these extremely large land developments. We need to strengthen the ordinances by adding clearing of trees within a phase is not permitted until permits have been issued for that particular phase. Wildlife corridors are another justification for extending the perimeter buffer to 50 feet. Replacing forests with lawns and macadam creates dead zones. With the extension of the perimeter buffers and the perimeter buffer protection area, you will provide wildlife corridors needed for everyone and everything to thrive. Audubon International states that many species of birds, even when migrating, will fly out of their way to follow wooded corridors rather than fly straight across open fields. These pictures were taken from inside my home. The geese, goslings, and fox were just on the other side of the silt fence. Not at the same time, of course. 30 feet does not provide an adequate screening buffer or a wildlife corridor. USDA agroforestry states that wildlife corridors need to be a minimum of 50 feet. Sadly, the Circle of Life did take the goslings one at a time, one day at a time, probably due to the gentleman on the right. These geese then stopped making the trek to Sarah Run every morning. My grandsons have been blessed to observe the wildlife around us here in Sussex County to this point, something we probably take for granted and took for granted when we were growing up. Extending perimeter buffers and providing adequate wildlife corridors is something we can all get behind. No one survives a sterile environment. That's why it's called a dead zone. One of the things I have heard from developers, and I'm sure you have too, is we will not give up density. I get it. However, I also recall developers touting large amounts of open space in their applications. So I went back and researched the latest group of applications made to PLUS and the county. This slide represents the average of 16 subdivisions that recently made application. These are their numbers from their applications. For cluster subdivisions, 30% is required open space. On paper, Sussex County developers are overachievers in the area of open space, ranging from 41 to 63%. The average subdivision application touts more than 50% open space in their design. As Steve pointed out, they will be able to achieve their density and provide the 50-foot buffer plus the 20-foot buffer protection area. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Steve for a quick summary.
Which sheet? she was using enter?
Button.
Okay.
Yeah, the other way.
Okay, we appreciate your time, and we know that you've been patient with us, but on behalf of the Sussex Preservation Coalition, we want to present our thoughts and recommendations, and so in summary, we respectfully hope that you consider these additional changes to the proposed ordinance that will, number one, recognize the function of perimeter buffers are valued just beyond screening and privacy, that mitigation requirements need to be greater for cleared areas of timber harvest to discourage the practice, that a 50-foot buffer for existing woodlands is going to provide benefits and values far beyond a 30-foot, but a 30-foot planted buffer we feel is adequate, that there should be no disturbance allowed in woodland buffer protection areas, that we redefine clearing and cleared areas, and that buffered planting standards need to be modified as we showed in order for them to be fully functioning buffers. And then just one other thing, but once again, we mentioned this at planning and zoning, but we do, and I understand why you might not want to reference directly in the ordinance to a list of recommended trees that do change over time. But there are some terrific resources out there for planning and zoning to reference related to appropriate trees to plant in these buffers. Thank you very much for your patience and time.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to comment? Anyone else like to comment? There's someone coming forward and back here. Joe, were you? You were the person in back I referenced.
My name is Joe Conaway. I'm chairman of CDAC. I will not keep you long. It was never my intention. I'm here for three things. One, I'm just overwhelmed by the amount of work that Mr. Lawson and Mr. Robinson and Mr. Whitehouse, welcome back, have produced here. And I can especially appreciate Mr. Lawson's role, having been there. But thereby lies the problem. I've heard a lot of comments today, good ones and bad ones. It's time that you go back to what you did and did so well with the wetlands. You created a special committee of stakeholders, and they put together an ordinance that I know is good because everybody disliked it. And in government, that's a home run in my business. So we would urge you to create a group like that to bring all this information together and come up with something that everybody can live with. Secondly, we think that anything now dealing with changes in land use regulations should have fiscal notes attached to them. We're talking about workforce housing, never heard that one time today, affordable when you started something with the ordinance you adopted today. Hearing what I've heard and the indefiniteness of some of the things, I'm afraid there'll be no workforce housing in this county, and our young folks just aren't going to be able to afford to stay. We just got great news, thanks to your efforts and your money. The medical school is a possibility in Sussex County, but for every doctor that stays and works here, we need 10 staff people. They're not going to be paid at the same level, so we need to do something. And third, I think it's time we look back at some of the older subdivisions. Pick a year, anything from 2010 forward, and let's go back in there, and whatever this ordinance ends up being, it ought to be used in that subdivision as well. Let's all share efforts to provide the protection of the forest buffer and that kind of thing. But They're the three things CDAC wants. We stand ready as always to help. We think that you're moving in the right direction. We do not oppose that ordinance. We do not support lots of things that we've heard. And we know that your past record, especially in the wetlands area, will bring us something that we all can live with, and that the cost of development, just the rough figures, $100,000 minimum, and that doesn't include the number of lots that are lost, which means people coming here are going to have to pay for a house that is not going to be in the $200,000 to $300,000 range. Thank you, and if I took longer than I intended to, I'm sorry.
Can I ask a question?
Mr. Riley.
Yes, sir.
When you say a fiscal note, how would you do that?
Well, let me just give you an example. I had an engineer go through the ordinance as it was originally proposed, and what we came up with, the new signage that just outlined it, could be as much as $2,000. If you have to hire someone to do the assessment, that could be $20,000. Long and short of it, $109,000, and that does not include the cost of the lost lots that would be taken for questionable reasons. It can be done, and I mean, it's just a matter of let's find out what we're doing as a government to cost the taxpayers more money. I hear and I've heard people say, well, the developers will pay for it. Yeah, but then they'll also charge you when you buy whatever they're selling. So nothing is free. And I saw a thing on the screen today that said something about a forest that was there, and I'm trying to remember ever seeing any trees at all there. So let's calm down and work this thing the way you have done in the past, and I think we'll all be better off.
Thank you. Sir, standing, you wanted to speak next, I believe.
Thank you very much. And very quickly, because I'm Frank Puerco of Lewis, Delaware, I did have a question when there was some conversation going on around the period of time for which a buffer has to be planted. And I went back to the definition section in 99.5F, where forest and landscape buffers is defined, and it states in the definition that that buffer shall be installed within 18 months from the date site work is authorized to commence, as documented by the notice to proceed letter from the commission. So I didn't know why that period of time that's already in the existing definition wouldn't be the period of time that was chosen for the ordinance to enact a completed buffer. So that was my only question when I referenced that back to the existing definitions. It seems to have an appropriate length of time already stated.
Thank you.
Well, I think we were talking about reducing that.
That's what I thought.
12 months, I think.
12 months.
Sorry, that was part of the conversation, but it didn't appear that everyone was aware that there was a specified time frame that existed. So I had to clear it up for myself as well as perhaps help someone else out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mr. Horner.
Good afternoon, John Horner on behalf of the Home Builders Association. I want to just start up front. I think that there needs to be an understanding of, a lot of times developers are doing things. There's not a nefarious intent behind it, and some of the comments that we heard from some of the speakers sort of imputed that kind of intent. So, for example, with buffers, developers don't want to cut trees in a buffer. If we cut trees in a buffer, we have to pay to cut the trees, we have to pay to grade the area, we have to pay to replant it, and then we have to sell lots for less because they're not backing up to mature trees. If trees are being cut in a buffer area, more often than not, it's mandated by either stormwater regulations or by the approved plan or by utilities. And that's certainly something that, I'm going to touch on lately or a little bit later. One other point, some of the other things about the buffer planning and why in certain phases a buffer may be planted later or may not have been planted. Well, there's practical reasons for that. It's not that the developer who is expending, millions of dollars in developing something wants to avoid the cost of planning the buffer for a period of time, it's practical. Let's say you have a very large development, 600, 700 homes, and a phase at the back of the project isn't accessible. You're only allowed to disturb a certain amount of land per SCD regulations, 20 acres at a time. So if I've got to get to the rear of a site to plant an area, particularly if that area needs to be graded, I can't get back there to grade that area and then to plant it until later on in the project. So if you put a hard and fast timeline of saying, hey, within 12 months you have to have this entire buffer planted, there's practical concerns of where there's plenty of scenarios where you're not going to have, one, the ability to disturb that much land in order to do those plantings if you have to grade in those areas, and two, the ability to actually get back there to access it. And then three, I think the most important part about buffers is we want buffers that are going to stand the test of time. Putting a buffer in early that is then just going to die doesn't benefit anyone. They'll get a little bit of shading of trees and things like that. And if you put something in early before you're able to properly grade it, before you're able to install irrigation, before you're able to do all of those things, that buffer is going to die. So I think that I understand the concerns, and frankly, it's a very hard job you have to sort of balance those competing interests. Because I understand if people that are next to a project that it's a later phase and they don't have the buffer installed and they're sitting here saying, hey, I want this screening. But at the same time, the developer isn't not installing it because he's saying, oh, I just want to delay this to delay the cost. There's practical concerns for getting back there. So I want to, again, sometimes it seems like there's a nefarious intent either inferred or supposed, not by you all, but the general public. And I want to make that clear. Similar to when we talk about, why a parcel may be clear cut at the commencement rather than cut in phases. Well, if anybody has seen the tree clearing operation, it is massive equipment, it is heavy equipment, it is big saws, it is dust, it is dirt, it is debris. And if you start at the beginning of a subdivision and you start building it and you start people moving in and you put in roads and then you take clearing equipment across those roads and do those operations while it's going on, all of your roads will get destroyed. Everybody that's moved into that community it'll be absolutely miserable. Whereas if you get it done in one go, you don't have to worry about the roads being damaged. You don't have to worry about those things for the people that move in. So it limits the disturbance of the timing of cutting. So again, is there maybe a better process for that as far as phase clearing? Certainly, that's something that I think actually SCD is looking into, how to sort of mandate that process. But again, I want to be clear that this isn't some nefarious intent by a developer that we just want to clear cut this thing just to get it done and mobilize it. It's, hey, if we don't do this now, we're dragging trees and stumps through finished roads, through finished houses where people are playing in their yards, where people are moved in, and it's creating major issues. One point I'd like to make, and it was good to hear from Mr. Robertson that he felt that utilities were allowed to be into the buffer area. I can't find that specifically in the ordinance, so if you can cite to that, or just to make sure, I want to be sure that it's in there, because it'd be tremendously unfair if Sussex County Sewer District said, hey, we want to bring sewer in the back of the project, you got to clear this 50-foot wide swath of trees, and then that happens, you clear the 50-foot swath of trees, and then you get a bill and a mitigation requirement from the other arm of the county. So certainly, as an association, we support this ordinance. I want to be clear on that from the outset. We support this ordinance, but we do want to make sure that you're able to get utilities in. And the concern that we had about, and Mr. Riley, you touched on this with the grading. There are scenarios where if the natural topography of the land in the buffer area drains on a neighboring property, and again, at the risk of sounding like an engineer, which I am not, but this is what has been explained to me by the engineers that I've talked to about this, that if the buffer is naturally draining, and it's a very limited set of circumstances, but if the buffer area itself is naturally draining onto the adjacent property, you're tasked with managing not just quantity, but also quality. And so with the expanded buffer areas, there's scenarios where under statewide stormwater regulations, the water, that is literally the water hitting the buffer area, and you having to manage for quantity and quality, that you may have to handle that water. And if that happens, the only way to do it in an existing buffer is by grading it. And so certainly you can collect everything from the internal parts of the subdivision before it reaches the buffer. But if you now have a 50-foot wide buffer area with a 30 plus a 20, and the calculations come out where you now have to manage that quantity and quality, then you've got a problem. And the regulations are going to say you've got to manage that water. And so I think it's a very limited circumstance of where you're going to have that. And that's why we ask for that relief to say, hey, look, if state law And we would also certainly support going to DENREC and saying, hey, pull the buffers out of your stormwater calculations, because we don't want to have to clear these things again. But as it stands right now, under DENREC law, and I certainly welcome you guys to confer with your engineers, what I'm saying is accurate, because I'm a lawyer, not an engineer, and I'm regurgitating what the engineers have told me. But under current law, there are scenarios where you would have to control the water coming from the buffer area, and that would necessitate stormwater management in that area. So that was one of the concerns that we had. A couple other things. One question I had on the bonding, there was the 2-year requirement from substantial completion, and I wanted to, and Mr. Robertson, maybe you can answer this. Will that be by phase? Okay, so I wanted to be clear on that. So if we could have language in there to clarify that would be by phase. Let's see. There was, to address some of the comments in the earlier presentation regarding density. Certainly, I guess if you want to say that developers have been overachievers as far as the percentage of open space, I believe that's accurate. But again, whether or not you are able to achieve the density with these increased buffers is a function of the actual site-specific features, right? If you have, let's say, for example, you have a really narrow piece of land, and now all of a sudden these buffers pull that piece of land in, and so now you can't get the lot depths to get all the lots. You could take a piece of land from being able to get full density to be able to getting no density. So I think the broad statement that, hey, because they've already been hitting these higher percentages, that they can get this density anyways, is just, it's practically untrue. It's just untrue and wrong. It's totally site-specific as to whether or not you could still get your density with these enhanced buffers or with any reduction in the space.
So you're saying that the buffers are not included in the density calculation?
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if you have a density on a piece of land and you have buffers, and we have minimum lot sizes. So, for example, if I have to have a lot that's a minimum size, minimum dimensions, and these buffers, if you make the buffers bigger such that in a site-specific instance, let's just take, you have this, let's say it's a narrow strip of land, and right now we've got 30 feet, you will lose density.
So the buffers are not included as part of the lot? There's a separate?
They're off lot.
Yeah, they're off lot, but they're included in the open space calculations.
Correct.
So it reduces the overall density calculation?
Well, we disagree on that. I think
it doesn't reduce the calculation. It reduces the
yeah.
functional ability to get it in, is what I'm saying.
It's site specific. The site that Mr. Horner's describing is unique. You know, if it's a more typical site, and the percentages we're seeing, I don't know that I'm not going to dispute what was presented, but they significantly exceed the 30% requirement for cluster developments, up in the 40s usually. I mean, you think about it. If it's a 7,500 square foot lot minimum, that's only 50. If it's a 7,500 square foot lot minimum, that's only 15,000 square feet per acre, because you can only get 2 lots per acre. So you got another, 30,000 square feet left over that, is being used up by roads, but there's still plenty of land acres.
But the buffers could count towards open space?
Yeah, they do count.
They do.
They do count. But it is, I agree, it's site specific, and geometry specific.
Correct. And that was just
Sounds
the
like
point.
it'd be an extraordinary circumstance.
I don't think I can think of at least 3 subdivisions off the top of my head where we would have been impacted by this in some way, shape, or form. Haley's Glen is a prime one where it's a long, narrow, skinny one, going back, where if you increase the buffers, it would decrease lot depths, and you would have an issue with actually getting the lots in. Your permittable density is still what's allowed by code. It's just now you have areas where lots cannot be, and it creates those issues. I guess my point in saying that is the argument that we can absorb sort of any increase in buffer because we have all this extra open space in all of our applications just isn't an accurate one, is what I'm saying. And even, the presentation up there where they said, hey, if you're going from a 30-foot to a 50-foot buffer in your 100-acre project, you're only losing approximately 4 acres of land. Well, we're going from 30 feet to 50 feet, and what they were asking for is to go from 30 feet to 50 feet plus 20 feet. So the current code is 30 feet. This new code is 30 plus the clear area of the 20, and what they're asking for is 50 plus 20. So really, on a 100-acre site, that's closer to 8 acres rather than 4. So I just wanted to be clear that we're talking apples to apples when we're looking at this. The other point that was made in the presentation was about the mitigation. I can tell you that the mitigation in there is absolutely certain to make sure nobody is going to cut in there. If you are going to have to replace trees to the degree that you're going to, pay fines to the degree you're going to, it's going to be effective. I have concerns. When this originally came out, I spoke to a landscape architect about, hey, what are these tree densities? What do they do? Are they effective? And the comment that I received from him was, hey, these tree densities are fine. If you start to get more dense, then the canopy starts to sort of consume itself, and then some trees won't survive. So I think just increasing the trees as a punitive measure is something that should really be thought about more in the context and consultation with a landscape architect to say what's going to be the most effective density of trees to be planted, rather than just, hey, don't make it 50, make it 100, because that's more painful. I do think the mitigation requirements will be effective. And then one other last thing that I would say is there was a little bit of discussion about green best management practices, whether you see rain gardens, ephemeral wetlands, things like that. One thing the city of Lewis did was in their buffer areas and as part of their open space, they encouraged the use of green best management practices in those areas, and it was sort of a hybrid. So a developer could say, hey, you know, this is an area where that maybe in that 20-foot area, I'm not allowed to do stormwater management features. But maybe that's where we look at some of these greener best management practices and incentivize the use of those, whether it be rain gardens, ephemeral wetlands, and that allows for the use of that space and sort of has some synergies with some of the other goals. So, but overall, the Home Builders Association is supportive of these efforts. We would have preferred a working group, as we've said before, and I think with some of these more and more complex issues that are going to be coming up to be addressed as part of the original working group, I think that would be a continued thing we would desire. But in this case,
any language on the green best practices that we might consider incorporating?
So the City of Lewis Code would probably be the best analog that I could think of, because they have some language in there. Now, they use it. For them, the carrot on a stick was that it would be counted towards open space. They don't count stormwater management facilities towards open space, whereas the county does, correct, Vince? So that was the carrot on the stick for them, and to say, hey, normally this pond, for example, would not be considered in your open space, whereas if it is an ephemeral wetland or a rain garden, we will consider it. And so here, what I would say is maybe in that 20-foot area, you say, hey, if you use a green best management practice, then you are able to use stormwater management facilities in that area. Just something along, it's just something to consider, that the City of Lewis has done, and I think it's been pretty effective. But other than that, we're really supportive, and we appreciate all the effort that's gone into this, and appreciate the consideration of our comments. Again, the big one being utilities and regulations. If the government or utility provider is necessitating us having to clear trees, we shouldn't be punished for it. That's our overarching. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to address this? Yes, come on up, please. Ma'am.
Good afternoon. It's been a long time since I've been here. My name is Michelle Koenig. I'm the Director of Conservation and Watershed Planning at the Delaware Center for Inland Bays. So I'm here today to read off the comments that we put together. So just starting off, the center is a nonprofit. We've been around since 1994. We are a national estuary program, one of 28 around the United States. We have worked for a long time with Sussex County, DENREC, municipalities, businesses, and universities to implement our comprehensive conservation and management plan, which is centered around protecting and restoring the Inland Bays watershed. Part of the CCMP is protecting habitat. We are also drafting an Inland Bays habitat management plan, so a lot of the discussion about wildlife corridors and things like that are particularly important, as our report is showing that we have very few wildlife corridors in some parts of the county, or at least in the Inland Bays watershed. So, these are all healthy forests. Buffers are all really important for all the reasons everybody has already said today. I won't repeat. And we are super excited to see this come forward. We applaud the work that you all are doing to protect an important but diminishing natural feature. We do have a few suggestions, though, that I'm just going to read off as it's written in our comments. I am going to reference the lines in the original drafted ordinance, so not the one that Planning and Zoning put out. So first, line 316, this is where it talks about the resource buffer ordinance taking precedence over this ordinance. We are just unsure if that means there's a potential for the resource buffer to be 30 feet instead of potentially 50 feet. For example, as written, the buffer width could be lessened to 30 feet if the resource type is a non-tidal wetland, intermittent stream, or ephemeral stream, which is according to, of course, the resource buffer widths outlined in section 115, 193. And so we want to make sure that that's not going to be the case if it, if it is woodlands, but it doesn't necessarily meet the definition of woodlands that's in the ordinance. It would be a shame for a potential 50-foot buffer to go to 30 feet. Lines 348 to 352, this is related to invasive species control. Todd brought this up. Yes, invasive species control is allowed, and it is said in the ordinance, but we're worried that it could be left to interpretation in the future, and it could cause some confusion. So we recommend separating out removal of invasive species from the woodlands is permitted to a separate line item. Again, just to prevent confusion. And then again, with line 359, to ensure there's no confusion about invasive species removal, we suggest adding, except for invasive species removal, so then this line would read, any removal or damage of trees within the woodlands, the perimeter buffer, or the perimeter buffer protection area, except for invasive species removal, shall be subject to the mitigation requirements as well as the violations and penalties located in this chapter. Next, line 413, we think this should be amended to add an option for wildflower plantings between and around trees, and should specifically exclude turf grass and or sod. As forests develop, there's always successional habitat that comes first, and so allowing some of these wildlife plantings would open up some different habitat areas compared to just forests, so that's something we would like for you to consider. Line 463, we think this should be amended to include non-invasive in front of ornamental grasses and or trees. That might be redundant, but sometimes it's good to be redundant just so that we all understand that we're not planting anything that's invasive. That's about it. A lot of conversation that was said today, we do agree with. I mean, we really need to be protecting our trees, and I understand it may be at a cost to something else, but we all have to give and take a little bit. So we really appreciate you looking at this and working on this. We really appreciate planning and zoning for working on this. And we do hope to be of help in the future. If anything like this comes up again, we'd love to be more involved. But for now, we just thank you very much for entertaining this. And do you want a copy so you can see?
Yeah. Thank you. And sir, I believe you had raised your hand before. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Greg Cordell. I live at the retreat at Love Creek in Lewis, and I live across the street from the Kindleton community where you saw that picture of the fence and the one row of trees. I know I've communicated since probably 2020. Mr. Whitehouse, thank you and your staff and others for responding to me about that as we went through the process. And Kindleton should be used as the poster child for what not to do with a perimeter buffer. And I hope you, that's what's always good about the past is we learn from it, and what's going on with this ordinance is really great work and what SBC is doing to support it. Just quickly, the Kindleton, and it goes to some of the things about the developers and the planning, because my questions are still, I'm still a little hazy on some things and timing when you, if we agree to 30 or 50 feet buffer. What happened in Kindleton is the initial plans that came out talked about filling that buffer area with 3 rows of trees, a walking path. Then there was an amendment to make it 1 row of trees. There's actually 2 or 3 amendments ending up with a swale having to be put in because of drainage. That was discovered after. And then the 1 row of trees that you saw, and then came the fence. So in addition to that, which I don't really, I think, ever explained, was Cedar Grove Road, there's two entrances, exits into the retreat at Love Creek. And what was done was, as you come past it, they put little not turnaround lanes, but passing lanes, so people could turn in, make the left-hand turn in and go around. So that encroached on that buffer area even further because it went outside the line of the road. Now, if you did this planning and the developer had already placed the lots, it has the lot lines, and then you have this buffer, and all these other things happen that eliminate the ability to have a buffer with planted trees. You know, there's a lot of these unique situations, and that timing of approving the buffer and people actually coming out and the engineering being complete, like how did they not know a swale was going to be there? How did they not know there was going to be these passing lanes, so forth and so on, to end up with that space? So I really hope you consider the timing of that and making sure that the buffer is solid, there's no issues before those houses fit in. The developer would not, if he had to go back further, well, that would have really messed up his plans, sadly for him, because the 90 so lots were fit in, you know, just tight. There's hardly any other open space in that community. So I just wanted to pass that along in terms of those other unique factors and the timing. Make sure the buffers are solid and in place so there's no amendments to create, you know, an exception for them, because it is an eyesore for passersby. It must be a terrible imposition on those 22 houses that were purchased along that road when they saw the plans, and then to end up with a fence in a very small lot right up against their house. So, and again, those trees will not be able to succeed, and it's just going to be a disaster. So again, thank you for all these efforts. This will really help our quality of life in this area going forward, and thanks to all the folks that are working on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else here that would like to speak in regards to this ordinance? Anyone else? Seeing none, operator, can you check online to see if there is anyone listening remotely who would like to opine?
If there is anyone on the line in favor of or in opposition to this application, please dial 5*. We have a caller. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, my name is Susan Tetsi Rosenblum. I just want to say that I support the statements made by Jill Hicks and Steve Sinclair and Rich Barrasso on behalf of the Sussex Preservation Coalition. I feel strongly that this is important legislation, and the language has to be exacting to avoid any ambiguity, so that the intent of the legislation to build homes while preserving trees and natural resources is not misconstrued. I also love the comments made by the Center of Inland Bays, as well as many of the other speakers. So thank you for all you're doing, and thank you for your time.
Before you hang up, could we get your address, please?
It's on 29 Aintree Drive in Lewis.
Thank you. Operator,
Thank you.
Operator, is there anyone else?
At this time, there is no one else on the line.
Thank you, Operator. Mr. President, this time we can close our public hearing on this matter. If council does desire to close public record, we can do so.
We will close public hearing. It's okay with council, close public record. Ask Mr. Moore to short title.
Thank you, Mr. President. And ordinance to amend Chapter 99, Articles 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6, all Roman numerals, sections 99-5, -6, -23, -26, -27, -30, -31, and -32, and by adding a new section, 99-21 lowercase a, and Chapter 115, Articles 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 28, Sections 115-20, 25, 29, and 15-37, 115-45, 115-53, and 115-28 regarding perimeter buffers around residential development.
I think Mr. Moore, you're right, but I think the actual thing is 115-218.
Okay. My apologies.
And it was the typo was wrong. It was your fault. Pleasure of council.
I think we should move to defer.
Motion, Mr. Riley, second.
Second.
Mr. Schaefer, to defer ordinance number 24-03. Any questions on the motion? We'll take the vote. Mr. Schaefer?
Yes.
Mrs. Green?
Yes.
Mr. Hudson?
Yes.
Mr. Riley?
Yes.
I'll be yes. Motion carried. Entertain a motion to adjourn.